Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're looking into
Turkey.
Turkey, yeah.
The seizure of companies in Turkey.
Right, so we've got a whole stack of sources here. Legal documents, research, news articles.
Yeah.
What we're going to be looking into is how these seizures actually happened and the impact that they had on businesses, specifically their net worth.
Yeah, and it's a story that highlights just how fragile economic stability can be when legal norms are disregarded. We're not just talking about numbers on a balance sheet. We're talking about real businesses, the livelihoods of employees, and the erosion of trust in a system that should be protecting property rights.
Right. Okay, so looking through this information about seized companies in Turkey, one thing that jumps up pretty quickly is a connection to the Gülen movement.
Yeah.
I think most of our listeners are probably familiar with the movement's history. It's focused on education, interfaith dialogue, those kinds of things. But things took a pretty dramatic turn in the 2010s.
Yeah. The Turkish government under President Erdoğan increasingly viewed the Gülen movement as a threat.
Right.
And ultimately labeled it a terrorist organization.
Right.
That declaration really set the stage for a pretty harsh crackdown.
Yeah.
And businesses that were seen as aligned with the movement, they became targets.
And that's where things get really unsettling. The government resurrected a rarely used legal tool, which is the appointment of trustees to manage companies. Before 2015, this was a pretty obscure mechanism.
It was, yeah. The legal basis for these appointments is Article 133 of the Turkish Code of Criminal Procedure.
Okay.
And what's alarming is how this article, which was designed for very specific circumstances, was suddenly being used against businesses with even just alleged links to the Gülen movement.
So basically, the government could just point a finger at a company and say, you're connected to the Gülen movement, and install their own people to take over.
Yeah, that's essentially what happened. And they tasked the Savings Deposit Insurance Fund, the SDIF, with carrying out these seizures.
So the SDIF, the Savings Deposit Insurance Fund, that's ironic.
It is.
You think of them as protecting depositors.
Right. You usually think of them as the people protecting bank depositors.
Yeah.
But in this case, they were given sweeping authority under this Article 133 to seize assets, sell companies, and even liquidate holdings.
So a body that's supposed to be protecting financial interests was used to dismantle businesses.
Yeah, and often at a fraction of their real value.
That's a huge conflict of interest.
It raises some serious questions about the rule of law and due process.
Yeah.
And the impact on these companies, I mean, it was devastating. One of the most striking aspects is the dramatic decline in asset size after these companies were placed under SDIF control.
So it's not even just a transfer of ownership.
Right. It wasn't just a theoretical transfer of ownership. It was an active dismantling of value.
Do we have specific examples of how much value was lost through this?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Let's take the case of Surat Cargo.
Okay.
Before the seizure, this logistics company was estimated to be worth something between $350 and $500 million.
Right.
A thriving business, a major player in the sector.
Yeah.
Under SDIF control, it was eventually sold for a mere $35 million.
That's mind-blowing. I mean,
that's a staggering loss of value.
A company loses over 90% of its value just by changing hands like that.
Yeah, and this case really encapsulates the kind of economic destruction that we're talking about here. It wasn't about preserving these businesses. It was about crushing them.
Wow.
And the implications go way beyond the financial losses. I mean, we're talking about the livelihoods of all the employees who lost their jobs, the effects on the Turkish economy, and really just the chilling message that this sends to any business that might be critical of the government.
And speaking of businesses being targeted, our sources point to Kaynak Holding as a prime example of this systematic dismantling. They were hit with tax inspections, searches based on, really flimsy allegations.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the appointment of trustees to 19 companies, a foundation and an association, all at once.
What's really disturbing about the Kaynak Holding case is the evidence, in quotations, that was used to justify the seizure.
Yeah.
So they cited finding a prayer list, and they claimed that employees had mentioned Fethullah Gülen. It completely disregards basic legal principles like the presumption of innocence and the non-retroactivity of offenses, meaning you can't be punished for something that wasn't a crime when you did it.
It sounds like if you prayed or you spoke the name of someone that the government didn't like, your whole business could be seized.
Pretty much.
That's terrifying.
And then the question becomes, who are these people that are being appointed to manage these companies, these so-called trustees?
Right, because if they were intentionally destroying value, you have to wonder about their qualifications, their motives.
Absolutely, and that's a crucial question, and the answer reveals a really troubling pattern. Many of these trustees had pretty concerning connections to the Erdoğan government and the ruling AKP party.
So it's almost like the goal was to reward loyalists with these positions of power,
Yeah.
regardless of whether they actually knew how to run a business.
Exactly.
Do you give us some examples, like who are these people? How many companies were they put in charge of?
Sure. So, for example, there's this guy, Bülent Navruz.
Okay.
He was appointed as a trustee to 110 companies.
110 companies?
Yeah, it's impossible to imagine how one person could effectively manage so many businesses.
That's just mind-boggling.
And there were several others like him.
Okay.
İmran Okumuş, he was appointed to 101 companies.
Wow.
Including Keynak Holding and its subsidiaries.
It definitely sounds like the motive wasn't economic efficiency or protecting the interests of the companies, but really political control.
Yeah.
And rewarding loyalists with these lucrative positions.
It's cronyism, and the consequences were disastrous for the Turkish economy.
What about the individuals themselves, though? Out of all these people who are given control of hundreds of companies, I mean, surely not all of them were qualified, right?
Yeah, I mean, you've hit on another really concerning aspect of this whole situation.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about potential incompetence. Some of these trustees had backgrounds that should have disqualified them immediately.
Are you saying that people with criminal records were put in charge of businesses?
Yeah, for example, Aytekin Karahan.
Okay.
He was appointed to Keynak Holding, despite facing charges of bid rigging, bribery, forming a criminal organization.
How is that even possible?
It's shocking, right? It defies belief that someone facing those kinds of allegations could be put in charge of a major company.
Sounds like they were trying to sabotage the companies.
There were other examples, too. Nevzat Demiröz, who was a trustee of Koza İpek Holding, he was the brother of an AKP deputy chairman.
Wow.
So these appointments point to this pattern of cronyism and just a blatant disregard for ethical standards.
It's a tangled web.
It really is.
Of political influence and these questionable motives that led to the decimation of Turkish businesses, the erosion of the rule of law, and I mean a chilling effect on the whole economy. And we've only just scratched the surface here.
Yeah, we've only just begun to delve into the specifics of how these trustees operated once they were in control. The stories of mismanagement, the corruption, the outright plunder, they're really shocking.
Well, this is where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dives. We'll examine the evidence of how these trustees ran these companies into the ground, the specific mechanisms that they used to drain value, and the human cost of this whole economic devastation.